Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Laura Bryant. Today is Tuesday, September 28th, 2023. We have had so many terrific programs here at the Merowitz Center, but one of our most favorite are the Presidential Legacy series. Thus far, we have featured 4 U.S. presidents: Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon Johnson, Harry Truman, and Franklin Roosevelt, plus First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. This afternoon, we are doing part 2 of the extraordinary lives of Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter. This is a 3-part series, and last month we covered the life of President Carter. Today, we're covering the Camp David Accords, and next month on October 19th, part 3 will feature the life of the First Lady. Back for part 2 is Josh Montanari, Education Specialist at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. As you may know, it is part of the Presidential Library System administered by a federal agency, the National Archives and Records Administration. Josh, we just read that President Carter and First Lady made a surprise appearance at the Plains Peanut Festival last weekend. His birthday is just a few days away on October 1st, and he'll be 99 years old, the oldest living and the longest lived U.S. president. So thank you again for taking the time to tell the amazing backstory of President Carter's life and leadership before and after the White House.
Very welcome. So anytime during the presentation, if folks do have questions in the chat, just go ahead and find a good moment, interject, and let me know. And I can answer some of those as we go along, if folks have those. Give me a moment here to get my screen shared, and then we'll get started. Okay, let me get my slideshow going. Okay, and as Laura mentioned, yes, we'll be celebrating President Carter's birthday coming up this weekend. His birthday's Sunday, but we're having a big event on site here on Saturday. Not sure if anyone's going to be making a trip to Georgia, but if you are, come on by and see us. We'd love to have you in here. But I'll do what I can here remotely to give you another great Jimmy Carter experience from where you are. So this today is called Crossroads of Curriculum, the Camp David Accords. So this is initially designed as a student program, but I think it has a lot of legs and also appeals to adult programs, but it really intersects with a lot of other topics that were happening in the Jimmy Carter administration. So we'll go ahead and get started. So just the basics of it. And here we see a great photograph from the National Archives on their first day there. Carter grinning, seeing Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel, shaking hands, meeting. This was hosted at the Presidential Retreat in Maryland, Camp David. Used to be called Shangri-La by earlier presidents. Dwight Eisenhower is the president that changes the name to Camp David after his grandson. This went on for 13 days from September 5th to 17th, 1978. That right there can maybe tell you the weight, the impact of this, because stop and think, how often do our presidents go anywhere for 13 days and focus on one thing? Not very often. So that should just tell you how important this was in history. This normalized diplomatic relations between Egypt and Israel, provided for return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and it did provide a framework for Israeli-Palestinian peace. And we'll talk in more detail about all of these points here. Just to throw something out there, might require a little bit of pre-knowledge here, but which of these events do you think is most closely linked to the Camp David Accords? Is it Arab nationalism and pan-Arabism? Is it the energy crisis, Middle East peace process as a whole, or the Cold War? I think they all have connections, but just wanted to see where people's interests lie or perspectives lie. Go ahead and put it in the chat box if one of those jump out at you. And I love the John Muir quote I have there that I think it applies to Camp David. When we try to pick anything out by itself, we find a hitch to everything else in the universe. This really does have a lot of legs and implications for not just our country, the world. Let's see in our chat box, we have a peace process. Yeah, it's the Middle East, a peace process, so it's definitely a part of that, yes. Anybody else have a chat response? It's okay if you don't, not mandatory. But you see, it really crosses a lot of other things that are happening. And that's really what characterizes Jimmy Carter's administration holistically. I think it's a lot of, and that's what presidents, I think, have to be willing to be ready for and willing to take accountability for is things coming to a boil that they necessarily didn't have a hand in starting or perpetuating. And I feel like that was Jimmy Carter's situation. All these things that were building up for decades kind of boiled over the pot when he came to office, and the energy, I'm sorry, Camp David Accords is definitely one of those. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. I hope. Oh, where am I at here? Okay, yeah, we'll go through those. So just to talk a little about each of those, Arab nationalism emerges after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War One. More or less, we carved out the lines on the map that we see today from that empire after that conflict. So that refers to the countries forming. Pan-Arabism is a reference to unity among those newly formed Arab nations against what they term the colonial tendencies and imperial powers. Just to give you some background, uh, we look at the United States in the post-World War era. Marshall Plan is a big part of recovery following World War II. 12 billion in aid to Western Europe, which would be 100 billion today. There's the formation of NATO, something that continues to be relevant despite end to the Cold War. Although I think we all know we're maybe in another Cold War with Russia. So that's happening. You see in the photograph there from the archives, the Marshall Plan in action there. Some people rebuilding in West Berlin. The Soviets are also trying to make their influence known after World War II. So they respond to NATO. They formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955 with the nations you see there, the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. We start seeing maybe posters like the one on the left there of a child wondering if an atomic bomb is going to drop. We see children exchanging messages at the East-West Berlin border there, I think before the Berlin Wall itself was erected. So then, and the May 14th, 1948, this is what kind of puts things in motion. After the end of British mandate in Palestine, the provisional government of the state of Israel is recognized by President Harry S. Truman. Sadly, the first Arab-Israeli conflict begins the very next day. But I just want you to look in at that document. This is one of those examples where, at least in my mind, when I think about the recognition of a country, you think it would be a much longer, more complex, substantial document. But that is it. That is all it was, are those two short paragraphs. And we can see Harry Truman's annotations and edits on there, noting that at the time that was the provisional government. And a big one we see, instead of authority of the new Jewish state, saying state of Israel, which I think is a more appropriate classification, because I think we know that not everybody who lives in Israel is of the Jewish faith. But we see him sign that May 14th, 1948. And that puts in motion more than 4 decades of conflicts. So I kind of have them summarized here. First one, 1948. 56, we have the nationalization of the Suez Canal by Egypt. Sparks a conflict with Israel, France, and Britain. And while the United States wasn't directly involved, that did did strain relations between the United States, Britain, and France because of the U.S. non-involvement there. The really consequential conflict was the Six-Day War in 1967. It's an extremely decisive Israeli victory thanks to the efficiency of their Air Force. I mean, they were taking off, going on a bombing mission, coming back, refueling. It was like a NASCAR pit team. They were just going nonstop. They literally took out the Egyptian Air Force, all of the Arab Alliance's Air Forces within hours. They took them out. So those people were at the mercy of Israel, and During that conflict, Israel goes to occupy the Golan Heights of Syria, the West Bank of Jordan, the Gaza Strip, and Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. 1970, we came really close to possibly sparking a wider conflict. In the war of attrition, Israel does shoot down 5 Soviet aircraft in that conflict. Luckily, that does not turn into something wider, but the possibility was definitely there. And then we had the Yom Kippur Ramadan War. Again, Soviets supported Egypt and Syria against US-backed Israel. Again, an Israeli victory, not so decisive. This one's a little more down to the wire. But a big consequence of that for the United States was initiation of the Arab oil embargo. And that really sets the energy crisis in motion at that point. I believe fuel prices went up something like 350%. So maybe remind yourself that next time you're at the pump. I know gas isn't as cheap as we would like it today. But that's almost like if our gas was up to $9-10 a gallon right now. And maybe some of you can remember that back when that happened in the early 70s. So here's what we're looking at with the Cold War map. So the areas in blue and in the light blue is U.S. and U.S. allies. Red and pink is the Soviet Union and their allies. And, you know, when we think of the Cold War, oftentimes our first thoughts are Europe or Eastern Europe, but it really was global. And when we look at the Middle East there, I mean, just look at North Africa, look at the Middle East, we see that blue and that pink right there, contrasting against each other. So it is definitely a front of the Cold War in the Middle East. And so we mentioned the Arab embargo of 73. This is what we begin seeing around the country at that time because people just start buying up gas before it gets more expensive every day. And the buildup to that was our population increasing 71% between 1940 and 80. Our real gross domestic product, basically our country's economic output, went up 508%. We got to remember after World War II, we are the only superpower standing. We are the only country that's really, for the most part, untouched by war. Our factories haven't been bombed out. Our infrastructure hasn't been wiped away. So we're really the only player in the game. Makes it easy for us to make that increase. And what's fueling that is 25% of OPEC's oil going to support us. And it was very, very cheap. And we had thought it would be cheap forever. So there really was no planning in place, no conservation efforts in place, just keep the oil coming. But then we saw that 350% increase. We started thinking otherwise. We started thinking about Plan B. Now, just to give a basic review of what a president can do in times of crisis, Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, the president, with the advice of this and consent of the Senate, can make treaties. 2/3 of them have to concur, so 67 of 100 senators have to approve any treaty that the president has. The president does appoint ambassadors like Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, very important people in the diplomatic process. Those also are confirmed by the Senate, checks and balances, but that's within the power of the president to choose the people that represent us and have dialogue with other nations. And then pretty straightforward, the president receives ambassadors and other public ministers, as we see him receiving Menachem Begin, literally on a red carpet with a bunch of paparazzi around. Looks more like a Hollywood premiere right there. But there they are at the White House welcoming Begin in July of 1977. Now, when it comes to Egypt, we had a much deeper relationship with Anwar Sadat than Menachem Begin. Sadat had been vice president under Nasser. He then became president. Begin becomes prime minister about the same time Jimmy Carter is elected to office. But this is kind of encouraging to see when we think about the polarization today. There is a lot of cooperation across multiple areas between the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations in the 70s. They really did work in tandem with each other in a lot of things. We don't see that that great polarization then in that time that we do today. But just kind of a general timeline here. In 71, Egypt really isn't a Soviet camp. They've got 15,000 military advisors in their country. They're receiving arms assistance. The economy's not really a free market system. 1972, though, maybe an unintended consequence happens when Nixon signs the SALT limitation treaty, the Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty with the Soviet Union. Part of that agreement made the Soviet Union unable to deliver on weapons they had promised Egypt. Anwar Sadat uses that as a catalyst to expel all Soviet military advisors, all 15,000 of them out of the country, and he begins moving the economy towards a free market system. In 74, President Ford continues courting Sadat. We see them having a pretty good moment there with some pipes. Sadat always has a pipe with him. In most cases, we see pictures of him. Usually has a pipe. We have one of his pipes on display here in our museum. Ford is successful in getting that Arab oil embargo lifted. So that's a really huge step right there. President Carter, when he comes into office, continues the dialogue with Sadat and Begin. A lot of handwritten notes, as we'll see here in the next slide. Convinces them to agree to formal peace negotiations. Sadat goes and visits the Knesset in Israel, the first Arab leader, I think still only Arab leader to do so. So that really was a gesture of goodwill. And I think that visit to the Knesset really set the stage for Camp David. So if we can meet in Israel, we definitely can meet somewhere else, like in the United States. So they scheduled those talks at Camp David for September 1978. So here we see a handwritten letter to Anwar Sadat from Jimmy Carter. And basically, he's writing the same letter to Menachem Begin. He's playing both sides here. Things like, it has to be you that moves this forward. You're going to be the leader of this process. But Jimmy Carter is a very personable president. Just the fact that we have these handwritten examples of correspondence. Think of the staff at his disposal. We could have formal letters typed up on White House letterhead. Here he is handwriting these notes to him and Begin. I mean, we even look at the next to last paragraph there. This is a personal appeal for your support. My very best wishes to you and your family. Your friend, Jimmy Carter, not yours in leadership. Sincerely, respectfully, your friend, Jimmy Carter. So he's really buttering them up to get them to the table, giving them a sense of empowerment that they're going to be the ones that come out of this, getting credit for creating this international agreement, boosting their nation's standing on the world stage. So again, while the Constitution prescribes the president's duties, sometimes it really is the person in office, the character, that can help facilitate execution of those constitutional duties. Jimmy Carter has to do a lot of homework, especially on Menachem Begin. Again, Begin has only come to power about the same time as Carter. While we know a lot, pardon me, that's supposed to be somewhere. New government phone. I have the sound turned off. It still rings. I guess they want to reach you whether you want them to or not. So here we see a memorandum from Carter from Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, basically telling him what to say, what not to say to Menachem Begin. So it really is kind of like a presidential homework there. We can see some underlined portions of that. I'll go ahead and it's pretty small there. So I'll read some of the underlined portions. Sadat has most recently emphasized the need for a clear Israeli commitment to the principle of withdrawal from all occupied territories, with some minor modifications in the 1967 line on the West Bank, and provided that Israel's security needs are adequately met. So again, providing reassurances that this is what the Egyptians are asking for, but we're going to give you some reassurances. It's not a complete giveaway. U.S. commitment to Israel's security is unwavering. That's a point we see highlighted. Sadat needs an Israeli commitment to eventual withdrawal in exchange for peace, recognition, and security. And I think the goal is to have Israel withdraw from all of those occupied territories from the Six-Day War of 1967. And then let's see, the last one, the question requires further clarification is the means by which the question of sovereignty will be resolved after the 5-year period. And I believe that is for a Palestinian state, because that is part of the negotiations that Camp David is trying to sort out, possibly withdraw from occupied areas and maybe a two-state solution. I think we all know we're still working on that. That doesn't get resolved. But these are things that his national security advisor is telling him the substantive points, make sure that he brings up with Menachem Begin. So again, this is an example. The president appointed Brzezinski, and this is the information he's giving him. So again, Constitution outlining that. Again, the Constitution mandates that checks and balances between the branches of government. It can take the form of this, a letter of support from U.S. Senators to Jimmy Carter. But the real meat of it is the second page, the last paragraph, before we see those signatures. And I'll read that out loud. We endorse your view that peace cannot be imposed from the outside, and that the United States does not intend to present the nations involved with a plan or a timetable or a map. Peace can only come from a genuine recognition by all the states, and their interests are served by reconciliation and not by war. That's pretty significant there. So basically they are saying, you are just going here to facilitate. You're basically a referee between these two. You are not going to impose anything from the United States on them. They have to figure it out themselves with your assistance. It does not play out like that. I'll tell you that much right now. We'll get more details to that. But so Jimmy Carter is definitely, this is weighing on him going in to these, that he is just there as a facilitator, a bystander, if you will. He's not there to be the principal deal maker. Now, again, trying to put ourselves back in the analog state. Again, a lot of Americans are having trouble connecting the significance of peace in the Middle East with what's happening at home. Unless you're reading the newspaper or catching that 1 hour of news with Walter Cronkite, you don't really know what's going on in the world. I mean, I can even remember, as a child in the 80s or 90s, growing up, if you ask somebody about something, off a ballpark figure off the top of my head, probably 8 out of 10 people would tell you, I don't watch the news. They wouldn't have any ideas. Now with the internet, social media, all that, the news finds us whether we like it or not. But not quite the case back then. So you can see this political cartoon kind of reflecting the sentiments of a lot of folks in America, more or less saying this is going to be a big waste of time. They put it in the concept of summer camp at Camp David. You see Anwar Sadat canoeing with an Israeli submarine, spying on him. Menachem Begin pricking the posterior of a horse while Sadat's riding it. Very graphically, we see Sadat fastening a noose for not tying. And then through all of it, we see Jimmy Carter getting roasted between the two there, which is, that bottom right corner. That's really what I think a lot of Americans saw was going to be the outcome of this, is just the United States is just going to come out of this weaker, unsuccessful, being seen on the world stage as not being able to facilitate a peace agreement, as some of our subsequent presidents have been, notably Bill Clinton when he tried. So it's hard communicating that. But this is at a time, the energy crisis, it's not just gas, it's everything. Nothing in society escapes that because businesses run on fuel. When their fuel costs go up, they either got to raise their prices and probably lay off some people. So that's where we get that stagflation from. Again, a reminder to not, maybe to ease anxiety about current conditions. We have historic low unemployment, somewhere around between 3 and 4%. A lot of the prices we're seeing, in goods isn't reflected in actual inflation. Inflation is, again, between 3 and 4%. Some folks have thrown around the term greedflation, with a lot of companies using the guise of inflation to add on, increased prices. So Carter's dealing with double digit of both. He's dealing with more than 10% inflation and unemployment. That's the urgency here. And all of that is stemming from higher energy costs. And it's really a point in American history where domestic policy, foreign policy, the line just gets thinner and thinner, if not non-existent. Can they be separated? I really don't think they can. When we're dealing with stagflation, that's a direct result of what's happening overseas, and with our, I guess you could say, flying by the seat of our pants energy plan, or a lack of an energy plan, just buying oil, not thinking about decades ahead. I think we see the end of that. But I think again, I model this for students, but you can see the importance of what we see happening in that photograph of having full cabinet meetings on a regular basis, because they're all connected now in this new global economy that we see emerging in the 1970s and 80s there. So the board is set for the Camp David Accords. First day is going to be on September 5th. So this was from one of Carter's books, showing the map of Camp David, which is Western Maryland, showing the layout, showing where various leaders were staying. And Carter had the idea to really intermingle everybody. There isn't necessarily an Egyptian corner of the camp, an Israeli corner of the camp, an American corner. Really, the only people that are all grouped in one area are the press. They're in the barracks there, ones that are covering it. But he's really got them intermingled. He really wants them to interact with each other, and even if they don't, to at least be aware of each other, I think, and see each other in their day-to-day activities, even when they're not in negotiations. Maybe to humanize each other, maybe to take away some of the angst and anxieties and ill feelings they might have had towards each other. So everybody's here in camp together. Jimmy Carter thinks bringing them to Camp David will be relaxing and peaceful out in Western Maryland. Ironically, after the summit's over, both Sadat and Begin both say we felt like prisoners in a compound the whole time we were here. So I don't think it had the effect that Carter wanted. And interestingly enough, when Carter was running for president, one of the things he was talking about was being a man of the people, doing away with a lot of the pageantry and luxuries of the presidency. He does sell the presidential yacht, so we no longer have a presidential yacht. We used to. He wanted to sell Camp David because he thought, why do we need a bunch of cabins in the woods for the president? After he becomes president, he's then privy to the fact that there's a nuclear fallout shelter for the government to operate in the case of a nuclear attack, located underneath of Camp David. So he decides to keep it and not sell it. It stays, and it works out for Jimmy. Gives him the place to host this summit. So the first day, pretty calm, just everybody arriving, getting situated. We see the photograph on the left of Carter giving Begin a tour. On the right, you're seeing Jimmy Carter's daily diary for September 5th. We have just about one of these for every single day of his presidency available on our website under our research tab. With the exception, I think, of the last 4 or 5 days in January of 1981. And I can tell you those days he was just in intense negotiations to get the release of the hostages in Iran. But we have one of these for every day. It shows you time of day, every meeting they're having, who they're talking to, who they're calling, who's calling them. It's very detailed. I will say, in full disclosure, occasionally you'll see a blacked out section here and there. If it's, my thought is usually that's probably somebody from the intelligence community whose identity has to be obscured from the public. But for the most part, these are pretty open and transparent, show you everything every day. I think it's fun to, if you have a special date in your mind from those years Carter was in office, go back and see what was happening that day. I went back to see what was happening on the day I was born. And apparently Jimmy was having a really cool country music concert at the White House with Guy Clark, which I think is pretty great. He's one of the great composers of all time, in my opinion. And there's even photographs, and that was happening 45 minutes down the road from Baltimore, where I was born that day. So that's pretty cool. So yeah, check that out on our website. Maybe you'll find some special connections with your own life there. But yeah, typically they're two pages. Most entries are 2 pages. There'll be some exceptions, as we'll see, but yeah, not too much happening on the first day. Now, days 2 through 3, they really jump into this. Basically, the goals of the summit here is to rewind the 6-day war. So going into this, Israel and Menachem Begin, they're really holding all the cards at the table here. It's the United States and Egypt, and Egypt is seen as a de facto leader of the Pan-Arab Alliance at that time. They're the ones spearheading all those conflicts. Yeah, they're trying to turn that back. Now, a point of argument for the United States and Egypt is the United Nations Resolution 242. Anwar Sadat is adamant about removal of Israeli settlements in Sinai. Menachem Begin campaigned for prime minister, promising he was going to retire in an Israeli settlement on the Sinai Peninsula. So he's got some promises he's kept that he's trying to keep intact here. But I mean, if there's going to be any headway, again, it's going to be Begin that's kind of taking a hit on it because, again, it's Israel holding all the cards. They're the ones being asked, normalize relations, withdraw from this territory, that territory. And just to look at UN Resolution 242, what they're talking about, this shows you the importance of language and maybe also when the importance of things being lost in translation. The section they're referring to is the withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, referring to the 6-day war. Menachem Begin points to that and says, that's really vague. That just says remove Israel armed forces from territories. It does not say all territories. So I might be open to Israel withdrawing from one, maybe more, but not all, because it doesn't say all. When they have Carter and Sadat saying, you know what it means, you know it means all territories. But again, you're a leader of a country, you're advocating for your people, for your interest abroad. You're going to take whatever path you can get, and that's the path Begin's going with, is the use of language in that UN resolution 242. So this is what hangs them up the whole time, because again, Egypt and US, this is what they're leaning on for their argument. Begin, again, he's leaning on it too at the same time. So different perspectives on the same document, different interpretations of it. And I think that you can look at that in American history, in the Constitution. A lot of vague language there. We've had a lot of amendments, a lot of laws passed in the place of amendments where we can't pass those because of vague language in the Constitution. But then again, sometimes vague language is what you need to move forward and not be just stuck on something. So it's a double-edged sword. Okay. So going back to that cartoon, here we see that bottom right corner of it. It's playing out in real life, very literally, same positioning and everything. There's Carter right in the middle, Begin on the left, Sadat on the right. Carter's kind of got an uneasy smile. I look at that. It's one of those, okay, everything's fine. Don't get carried away. I read a book called 13 Days in September about the Camp David Accords. And there I read that what's happening here is Anwar Sadat has just aired the grievances of Egypt against Israel for an hour and 15 minutes. Menachem Begin is responding in kind with about 1 hour of rebuttals to Anwar Sadat's grievances against the state of Israel. I think maybe with one exception, this is the last time all three of them are in the room together. Carter, as the official referee, decides nothing's going to get accomplished with these two. They just cannot stop going back and forth, grievances, rebuttals. No progress is being made. So they all agree from that point on, they are going to communicate. He's going to meet with them one-on-one, or they're going to meet with the delegations that have traveled with him. But we're not going to have Sadat and Begin together in the same room because it's just not going to be productive. So yeah, Jimmy Carter really is kind of getting roasted in between these two here. He's supposed to be able to easily facilitate this agreement, and he's got his work cut out for him. And I think this is where he starts thinking, I might have to take a calculated risk and go back on what I committed to those U.S. senators that wrote me that letter. I might have to put forward a plan if these two can't come up with one themselves. So again, things just keep on intensifying around UN Resolution 242. I love this photograph. This photograph is just, I think, so many layers to it. We're here at these peace negotiations. It's really one big chess game. But you see Menachem Begin on the left, and that's Carter's National Security Advisor, Brzezinski, on the right. You see Brzezinski really, really pondering this next move. Now, I read that Brzezinski commented, Begin was a pretty good chess player, but he was better and probably could have easily bested him, but chose to hold back in this. So it's interesting to think about that at that dimension of being a representative of a country. Here's someone who's in complete disagreement with you, and you're trying to convince him your point of view. You might have to take it easy on him in chess. And that happens, especially when there's a photographer around documenting it. So needless to say, there's a lot of walking on eggshells as another dimension of facet to these talks. But again, we really don't make any progress on these days aside from meeting with delegations and Begin and Sadat individually. So we're not just exchanging grievances. Carter thinks they need a break from the compound, as Sadat and Begin termed it. They're not too far from the Gettysburg National Military Park in southern Pennsylvania, so they kind of take a field trip there to break up the monotony of Camp David. It's probably about 30, 45 minutes away from them, not too far of a drive. Gettysburg is still the largest land battle that ever occurred in the entire Western Hemisphere. We basically had the casualties of the 12-year Vietnam War in 3 days. Let that sink in. 12-year Vietnam War, 3 days in the American Civil War, basically because they were still using Napoleonic tactics with new technology, much more accurate cannons and rifles, like the cannon Menachem Begin's looking in there. So he's got them on the battlefield, maybe trying to remind them these are the consequences of failing to reach an agreement, of failing to compromise, the find common ground there. And so I think a pretty good place to do that at in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania there. And I'll give you a tip. If you go to a Civil War battlefield, don't do what they're doing with your hand in the cannon. Don't look into it. I was at Gettysburg as a kid. I looked into an unplugged cannon, thinking what it would do to me if it was real. Bird flew out, smacked me in the face. Terrifying. The Park Service does a pretty good job of plugging them for preservation, but if you see an unplugged cannon, don't go prodding around it. You don't know what's going to come out of there. Okay, so trying to find some levity, give these folks a break from intense negotiations doesn't seem to help too much. In fact, during all of this, Rosalynn Carter's there. She's being told, don't look too happy to make people think we've been successful. Don't look too down so they think that things aren't going good. She eventually took her own field trip and went back to D.C. with Amy Carter to take a break from it because she felt stressed and pressured from all of this. So days 7 through 10, we're just butting heads. We're not making any progress. They're deadlocked over territories that Israel would withdraw from. Carter receives word that Sadat literally has his bags packed on the porch of his cabin. He's instructed his helicopter to come pick him up. Carter immediately goes to intervene. And this is really I think a very meaningful photograph here. We usually don't see Jimmy Carter with a look like that on his face. In his book, A Full Life Reflections at 90, Carter wrote, "This was the most uncomfortable conversation of my entire life." I mean, we all tend to think of Jimmy Carter as this happy, positive, upbeat guy, man of the earth. I mean, Carter grows up in the Depression, World War II. He goes to the Naval Academy in Annapolis. You got to be a pretty tenacious, hardened person after you get out of the Naval Academy at Annapolis. So he's been through some adversity. So to say this was the most uncomfortable conversation, when I was in an audience with President Carter, I couldn't resist when they opened up the questions. I asked him, why was this the most uncomfortable conversation of your life? And he stared at me with those ice blue eyes, that kind of burned a hole through me. I could feel it. And said, well, made it difficult. This was uncomfortable because Anwar Sadat was my friend. He was a legitimate friend. He wasn't just someone I talked to because I had to, because I was president and he was president. We had a great relationship, and I knew I had to go threaten my very good friend. I guess these days they call it ghosting, where you just stop talking to somebody that you have a disagreement with. You don't want to have anything to do with. You just stop dealing with them. Carter has to go and confront them. And he basically proceeds to tell Sadat, if you leave, you're going to be the scapegoat for the failure of this. You're going to get all the blame. Relations between our countries are going to be strained, and our friendship will be off the table. That's what President Carter told Anwar Sadat. Again, the Constitution prescribes the duties. It's the person in that position though that implements them. And I think Carter was an effective negotiator. He convinces Anwar Sadat to stay and stick it out. So on it goes. So we're getting to the end here. Now this letter, again, handwritten by Carter, not typed up by an aide or a secretary. Again, very personable. I'll go ahead and read it out loud. To President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin, we are approaching the final stage of our negotiations. With your approval, I propose that today we receive your most constructive recommendations, that tomorrow, Saturday, be devoted to drafting efforts, and that we conclude the meeting at Camp David at some time during the following day. We will at that time issue a common statement to the press, drafted together. Additionally, we should agree not to make any further public statements prior to noon on Monday. Please let me know if you object to any of these proposals. JC, Jimmy Carter. I mean, what's the tone of this letter? Does this sound like they've met with success? Does this sound optimistic? It sounds like they're doing damage control to me. You know, nobody talked to the press. We're all going to form a statement together. Basically, I think that what he's saying is we're going to put some lipstick on this pig. And if we all go down together. If it's seen as something positive, we all get credit together. So what I take out of this is they have not gotten to the point they want to get to by September 15th. So the final day, the 13th day, a race to the finish. I have one page of Carter's diary that day. I mentioned typically there are 2 pages most days. This day's entry had 4 pages, twice as much. You can just look at this one page here. Let's see, beginning, I think, with like the 3rd entry, the president talked with Secretary Vance, 7:17 to 7:19. President talked with Senator Byrd, 7:20 to 7:22. President talked with Representative O'Neill, 7:36. It's just a marathon of Carter making phone calls, going from cabin to cabin in Camp David. And, you know, I had one student ask, how is he in this cabin, this min, that one, the next? And I think we can find a primary source to shed light on that. And that's what you see there. Jimmy Carter had this bike at Camp David. He would ride that bike cabin to cabin, talking to this delegate, talking to the Sadat, talking to Begin, talking to his national security, just zigzagging all over Camp David on that bike, which I believe we have in our collection here at the Carter Library. So that's how he's getting around. But it's neat to see how you corroborate, you know, primary sources with each other there. But he talked to so many different people on that day. But it's hard to see what the catalyst was just from looking at that diary. One could say that really intense engagement, inclusive negotiations from all these people they talked to must have been the key to success, but it really isn't on those pages of that diary. It's what's happening in this photograph here with President Carter giving a gift to Menachem Begin. He had told Menachem Begin that he would give him a couple photographs autographed to give to his grandchildren. Well, Carter had his secretary reach out ahead of time, and he gets the names of all of his 8 grandchildren, and he personalizes a photograph to each and gives them to Sadat. So that's what we see happening in the photograph, is Carter bringing that gift. Now, hopefully this is going to work for me. I have a video, though, Carter later explaining exactly what transpired and what was the catalyst for the success they did get at the Camp David Accords.
The last day was a turning point because we thought we had failed. And we were getting ready to leave Camp David in failure and go back to Washington and announce that we had not been successful. And Prime Minister Begin asked me if I would sign a photograph for his 8 grandchildren of me and Begin and Sadat. And I agreed to do it. And my secretary, whose name was Susan Clow, got the names of Begin's 8 grandchildren from Israel. She called over there and got their names. So instead of saying best wishes, Jimmy Carter, I said with love and best wishes to, and I put down his grandchild's name and I signed it. And I took it over to his cabin to tell him goodbye. And when he opened the door, he was very angry with me. And he said, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." He was always very proper. And I said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister, and I'm sorry we hadn't been successful. I brought the photographs you asked for," and I gave the photographs to him. And he turned around and said, "Thank you, sir." And then he looked down at the photographs, and he read out loud, "Love and best wishes to," and he read his grandchild's name. And he put that over in the back, and he read the next one's name. And he read the third one's name, and his chin began to quiver, and tears ran down his cheeks, and mine too. And he said in effect, "Why don't we try one more time?"
So there we see a personal gesture.
The last day was a turning point because we thought
So again, the Constitution doesn't prescribe that. It doesn't tell a president how to do that. So who's to say if Gerald Ford hadn't won the 76 election, maybe he wouldn't have figured out a way to really reach Begin and touch him on a personal level to build that necessary trust. It might have happened. But here where we see Jimmy Carter, he was successful in that. And like I said, the Constitution can't prescribe that. Your national security advisor can't prescribe that on you. That was the man there, his lived experiences making that happen. And so of all the negotiations, it's crazy to think though, but we hear from Carter, it's that personal gesture that builds the trust with Begin. Because again, Begin's new to the office, Carter's new. They don't have a lot of trust. They don't have a lot of history together like they do Sadat. And I think that's really what was hanging up the Israeli delegation, was just not knowing Carter, not having that level of trust to enter into this binding agreement, any kind of binding agreement or treaty. But that gesture gets it done. So they do arrive at a framework, what's called a framework for peace in the Middle East. And that's, in other words, something that they each have to bring back to their respective legislatures to pass, according to their constitutions. So I guess you could say this is the rough draft of the peace agreement there. That's what we see them signing there in that photograph at the right. We don't quite get everything in there. So we do, as mentioned, get normalization of diplomatic relations between Egypt and Israel, and removal of Israeli forces from the Sinai Peninsula. Which are huge accomplishments. And that's still intact. 40 years later, we have not had open conflicts with Egypt and Israel. And given that history they had, and for that to be intact for 40 years, I mean, that's an amazing accomplishment for any president to make, between warring nations there. You see the celebrations happening on on the left there, a man holding up a T-shirt with Bacon and Sadat. All you need is love, taking the Beatles song there. So unfortunately, though, the Israeli-Palestinian peace was left unresolved in this. The Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip. And future U.S. presidents, particularly Bill Clinton, would try to take that up. He was also unsuccessful with that. But here's a photograph when Bill Clinton was an extremely young governor of Arkansas. He had been the Attorney General of Arkansas, was elected governor. And we see him there meeting with President Carter. Maybe a little foreshadowing that he would be carrying on the efforts of that other Southern governor president. And that was in the White House there. I do have a slide about some further inquiry, and I'll provide this to Laura, and Laura can forward this to all of you. And these are hyperlinks, so you click on them, they'll take you to that thing. So we do have documents on our website about the Camp David Accords. If you have any kids or students, we have a unit on that and some lesson plans, as well as AP document-based history exercises. Books by Jimmy Carter. There is The Blood of Abraham. We Can Have Peace in the Holy Land and Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. And then there is I think it's a pretty long, lengthy video there from the National Archives, way too long for this presentation. I think it's over an hour. You can watch it, really gives you the whole thing there. So thank you very much for being with me here today. I love ending on that slide. Menachem Begin. Shalom, y'all. Gift he's given to Carter. And that's actually on display in our museum, that very thing in his hand there. Peace, y'all. Thank you so much for being here with me. Now, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer anything, whether it's about President Carter, whether it's about the Camp David Accords, about the library, or National Archives. I'm happy to answer any of that. So just go ahead and let me know, and we'll take a few minutes and talk about it.
So Josh, do you want to close out the slide so we can see everybody?
Yes, I will stop sharing the screen there. Okay.
There we go. Okay, everyone, welcome back. That was really a great summary, a lot of history, and some of the things that you talked about domestic versus international, and how they just meld once you have a global economy, and how one thing led to another. That was very insightful. Does anybody have any questions? I don't see any hands up. I don't see any questions. I have one comment. So I was in college in the late 70s, and I remember the gas line and thinking what was going to happen to our nation. And, as I was getting ready, looking at graduation and, going to be a full-fledged adult. And Jimmy Carter's burdens while all of this was going on, and how complicated it was. I think I have forgot that until you went through this program today. And I really appreciate the history lesson, because it reminds me I need to go back and do some more reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really was a crossroads when Carter comes in the office. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something every person running for president should expect, that you're going to go in, you're taking over for the last person, just as they did from their predecessor. You're going to have to deal with a lot of things maybe they initiated, whether you like it or not, just like your successor is going to deal with your stuff when you leave. Carter, I think, was dealing with quite a few president stuff that was coming to the forefront through no doing of his own. I'm not here to be a Jimmy Carter cheerleader. I'm an impartial person, but historically speaking, I think he did everything you could possibly do for all the things that were happening at that time. Because it really seemed anytime Jimmy Carter had a big breakthrough and a victory in one thing, something else would come. We had that era of oil embargo. Ford got it lifted. Things kind of started stabilizing, a little bit. And then you have the hostage crisis in Iran. They nationalized their oil and right back up. All of that goes.
So my question was going to be, if you could recommend one book I know you've got a list of different, what would be the book you would recommend?
That was, I would say 13 Days in September. Oh gosh,
Okay.
let me. Oh gosh, the author's name is completely fleeting me. Let me just do a very quick type here. And I'll get that.
Okay. And Rita, did you have your hand up? Okay, so you're going to have.
By Lawrence Wright, Wright.
Okay, thank you very much for that suggestion.
Very welcome.
Okay, I think Rita has a question. Go ahead, Rita.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Josh, I forgot this. What is Wright's first name?
Lawrence.
Lauren. And
And Susan asked if I would share slides. Yes, I'm going to share these with Lauren. She'll forward them to all of you.
oh, great. I think you've mentioned this before, but if I didn't write it down, I don't remember it. Is there online at the I'm sorry where you're coming from, but where you get all this information? Is there brain is really having trouble today.
That's okay.
Put it on your computer and it takes you to whatever place you want to go, like library or whatever.
Mhm.
So what is there such a thing for where you work?
Oh, for what? Yeah. So our website is jimmycarterlibrary.gov.
Okay.
The National Archives website is archives.gov, G-O-V, when I say gov. And from
Thank
there,
you.
you find the National Archives catalog.
Okay. Thank you.
And Josh, can you read the comments in the chat?
Yes, I see them now. So it says, Josh, original question, what is your answer? Peace process or energy issues? The most influential thing in that, I have to say it's probably the energy issues, because that's what's affecting Americans. That's what's making Jimmy Carter's approval rating go down, is people seeing gas prices go up, unemployment go up, inflation happening. I think we all know that presidents really don't have control over those things, but in their position, they're the ones we look to for accountability on that. And it really was like a national security issue when we think economically. Again, we had, that looking at that gross domestic product we had before the rest of the world was on their feet. It needs fuel to keep that big machine running. Whether that's a factory that needs fuel, whether it's the delivery trucks that need fuel, whether it's the railroads that need fuel, the airlines need fuel, the workers need fuel to get to the job that they're working. Nobody could escape that. So I think overall it was energy. But Jimmy Carter is a very spiritual person, and I think at these talks, I think each of them saw themselves representing the major religions of the world. Begin, almost like the Moses here. Sadat, is Muhammad. Carter, as representing Christianity. We're really seeing the little microcosm of the Middle East there between the three leaders, and I'm sure there was a definite personal interest with Carter. Knowing the Bible, the Christian Bible back and front, seeing how there was always war back and forth between the Israeli people and their adversaries, that maybe he would have this historical stake in it. So I'm sure he definitely had a personal interest, but as president, I think energy is the overriding reason we want to get this done, to stabilize the global economy that's emerging at that time and pull America out of stagflation, which is tough. I mean, Reagan took his stab at it after Carter. I think he got inflation a little under control, but his unemployment, figures were still pretty high in the 80s. It's hard solving those it was years after Carter, Reagan, even before we really got that under control, just showing that impact of the global market then, even in its emerging stages, not as permeated as it is today. So yeah, thanks for bringing me back to that, Keith. That's a good circle back there. Thanks.
Looks like we have one more question.
Okay.
We've got a digital hand up. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I think you're muted.
That's me. That's me. Okay. I just read that at age 94 that Carter went to Israel, and he said he didn't see any way that there could be any peace with Netanyahu and Abbas. I thought that was interesting. But the thing that I'm confused about, and I read about this and everything, is what exactly was the reason? Was it because it was signed an agreement that Egypt kept the peace with Israel all these years? Because it's so unusual in my mind that would happen.
Mm-hmm. Right. That was a tenet of the peace agreement that they did formally sign, was that they would normalize diplomatic relations with each other, and that Israel would withdraw all its military presence and settlements from the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. So Menachem Begin took a hit there. Again, he admitted that that was a campaign promise of his, that Sinai Peninsula will always be part of Israel. I'm even going to retire there. But I think Andrew Young, who was Jimmy Carter's one of his UN ambassadors, he was later mayor of Atlanta, here where I'm at. He basically sums it up. What this agreement did was, in 40 years, not a single Egyptian soldier has killed an Israeli soldier, and not a single Israeli soldier has killed an Egyptian soldier. And for that part of the world, for lack of a better phrase, that's a hell of an accomplishment.
And if I remember correctly, wasn't Anwar Sadat assassinated right after that, I thought?
Yes, he was. Now, Sadat and Begin both received the Nobel Peace Prize for this agreement.
Right.
They both thought Carter should have gotten it. He gets it later in 2002. But yes, Anwar Sadat, I think less than a year later, is observing a military parade in Egypt when some folks break formation from the parade and open fire on him in the stands, and they do kill him there. So Sadat pays the ultimate price for his role in this peace. But I think we can all see that he's been exonerated for that because it's still intact. And how many lives did he save from further conflicts between Israel and Egypt? And who's to say that increased involvement from the United States and the Soviet Union on both sides, that wouldn't have culminated in a wider conflict, possibly another global world war, if it hadn't happened. So I think it's definitely impacted all of us, continues to impact us today. Let's see, Susan says subsequent peace with Jordan. So yeah, with Jordan, we've made some peace there too, and we do see that there's now diplomatic ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I think that happened in the Trump administration. So it's beginning to open up over there.
Thank you.
But I don't think any of it would be possible if we hadn't gotten this very big piece of it, the peace process done with Egypt, given that they were the spearhead of all the conflicts of Arabs against Israel. You're very welcome.
Anybody else? I think we're going to wrap up if there aren't any other questions. Looks like someone has said, well done.
Does Rita have her hand up again?
I think it's from before.
Okay.
No, it isn't. I had
Oh, you got another question? Oh,
another
okay.
question, just kind of a statement.
Okay.
Josh, you said earlier in your talk about presidents not having as much power as the public thinks they do. And so that, it's like some of the treaties when you become a president that you learn about, the public has no idea about, you know. And every time it comes up at election time, it's like people we want you to do this or that. And you can't even say to them, you can say, I can't tell you because it's confidential. And people just think that's kind of an excuse because you don't want to deal with it or something. So I appreciated you just bringing that little thread up in there. The public needs to understand that better.
Right. I think any time a new administration takes office, the first thing you hear is so-and-so signed 50 executive orders today. An executive order does not take the place of the Constitution, of a constitutional amendment. or a nationally passed law. Typically, an executive order is facilitating one of those things when there's vague language involved. For instance, if a law is passed that says we're going to reduce greenhouse emissions by 50% by 2040, that's very vague. Okay, great. How do we do that? An executive order is, I ordered a task force to be formed to explore how we are going to reduce greenhouse emissions by that, if that makes sense to everybody. Because we don't have a king or queen, we don't have a dictator. We have a president who has checks and balances with other branches of government. So yeah, when you hear all those executive orders, don't fret. Again, they don't take the place of the Constitution or laws that we have passed. They just facilitate something to happen that's already been decided.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Okay, well, see everybody next month.
Yep.
Right? We'll
Take care,
wrap
everyone.
up with Rosalynn Carter.
Very
And have a great birthday celebration this weekend.
Thank you so much. We sure will. Take
Thank
care.
you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.